Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Wednesday, June 15th, 2016. Here are our top stories.
Tonight, Donald Trump and the NRA might be planning a stealth gun ban, which will add millions of Americans on the terror watch list. Meanwhile, an Islamic refugee is arrested on the New Mexico border in possession of the region's gas pipeline plans. Then, what would Jesus do at the gay bar shooting in Orlando? Plus, creeps in space. NASA wants to put human clones on a Mars colony, and they're ready to use crony capitalism to get them there. All that plus much more up next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
Well, what is the lesson that we need to learn from this Orlando shooting by this Islamic, who appears to be a homosexual? So many different angles to this, but what is the issue? Well, the issue that everybody is seizing on is gun control. The real issue has to be Border Patrol. And there are signs that Donald Trump certainly understands that. He's been pushing that narrative, but there's also signs that he is starting to slip. He's starting to slip into the gun control camp along with the NRA. Is this something that is going to be unlike all others? I believe it will be. We have a Reuters editorial that we're going to talk about here in just a moment. They say this event is going to be different because it's activated the LGBT lobby, a very powerful lobby. And it also speaks to what conservatives say they want, which is national security. They worship at the altar of that false god. Will they sacrifice our gun rights to it without us really realizing it? Now, first, let's talk about what the real narrative is. We've got a story here as people are pushing back on Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina. He is the Senate Intelligence Chairman. He defended Trump, but he argues that a Muslim ban is not on the table. He is chairman of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee. He says that GOP nominee Donald Trump is calling for a temporary pause and not a ban on Muslims entering the country. He said in his speech, listen to it, he did not say ban, okay? He spoke with a handful of reporters yesterday. He said there's a big difference between a ban and what he said. He said he called for a pause. Now, this is while Paul Ryan is repeatedly saying that Donald Trump is calling for a ban, And of course, we've got Burr saying, I'm telling you what I read in his speech. You can spin it however you want. I heard the speech. He talked about a pause. He did not talk about a ban. Now, that's very true. Conservative commentator Hugh Hewitt, who I don't trust. The man is a hardcore neocon, never Trumper, open borders, the rest of the stuff. This guy is now saying, well, I think Richard Burr would be a great Senate candidate or vice president candidate for Donald Trump. Let me tell you something. If Richard Burr, I know Richard Burr, I'm from North Carolina. If Richard Burr becomes the vice presidential candidate, I'd really have to seriously think about whether I would set this election out or not. Because he is cut from the same stuff as Jeb Bush, as Lindsey Graham. He's a very dangerous person. He doesn't respect any of our rights. And even though he is correcting what Paul Ryan is saying, he is still very dangerous. Now, it truly is about the border. As I've said before, what difference does it make if you're going to have gun control if you let terrorists into the country? They can get nuclear, biological, chemical weapons. They can create bombs. They can even kill people with knives, as we saw in France, in Paris. You had a police commander and his wife executed in front of their 3-year-old child as he held them hostage and put the videos out on Facebook with a knife, not with a gun. And then take a look at this from Judicial Watch. An Islamic refugee with gas pipeline plans. See, they don't even need to have a bomb or nuclear or biological chemical. They just need some plans on something they can blow up. An Islamic refugee, quote unquote, with gas pipeline plans has been arrested in New Mexico border county. Police in a U.S. town bordering Mexico have apprehended an undocumented Middle Eastern woman in possession of the region's gas pipeline plans, say law enforcement sources. They told that to Judicial Watch. And of course, Judicial Watch has broken a number of stories in the last few years about Mexican drug traffickers smuggling Islamic terrorists into the United States through porous southern border. You see, if you let a terrorist in, you'll find anything, including our gas pipelines, to attack us with. The issue is controlling the borders. If you can't control the borders, if you won't do background checks on people when they come into the country, what makes you think they're going to be able to or willing to do background checks on people once they're in the country? None of these things, nuclear, biological, chemical, gas pipelines, all those things have the potential to be far more dangerous than a single rifle or even multiple rifles. At the same time, we have a Reuters commentary where they say Sandy Hook didn't change our gun laws, but the Orlando shooting might. They say the Orlando shooting is different from all the attacks that we've seen in Brussels, Paris, San Bernardino, different from Sandy Hook and all these other places that they list. They say the difference is because now there's an alliance between gun regulation and the LGBT advocacy groups, the very well organized social movement. Nobody has more money, nobody has more clout, really, quite frankly. We'll talk about the NRA, let's talk about the LGBT. They have a tremendous amount of power. They're a very politically lucrative group, and they are going to be coming for the guns. And then they point out, and further in this editorial, they say one of the most controversial breaches of fundamental constitutional rights permitted the National Security Agency to turn its signal interception inward, to spy on all American people without obtaining legal warrants. Yeah, that's the FISA Star Chamber. He says public calls to regulate firearms for national security reasons and possibly save more American lives despite Second Amendment rights should not come as a surprise. To improve Homeland Security, the argument goes, U.S. citizens would be better protected if more restrictive background checks were performed, if people were required to prove good character. This could include not belonging to any group prohibited from owning firearms. So he lists a few groups that we would do right now, like the mentally ill, people who are labeled as terrorists by our government. This is something that Barack Obama and Donald Trump agree on. It's something that Jay Johnson, head of Homeland Security, as well as the NRA, agree on. And they are pushing the narrative of national security, as I pointed out, that false god that they worship, that they sacrifice all of our freedoms to for the mere promise of safety, and we will not get that. And of course, immediately after this happened, Piers Morgan goes on Daily Mail. Of course, Piers Morgan is a friend of Donald Trump. He won The Apprentice one year. And he supports Donald Trump in everything he says, except in guns. And he writes this editorial, headline, "We've had a no-fly list for suspected terrorists for years, so why not a no-buy list? It's time for Trump and the NRA to show whose side they're really on." And unfortunately, it sounds like Donald Trump is listening to that. It sounds like the NRA is listening to that. We have reports, and of course, this has come out via Twitter, which is where Donald Trump makes his announcements. I'll be meeting with the NRA, he says, who have endorsed me about not allowing people on the terrorist watch list or the no-fly list to buy guns. And then the NRA comes back and says, happy to meet Donald Trump. Our position is no guns for terrorists, period. Due process and right to self-defense for law-abiding Americans. Oh, let me ask you this. How do you not have, if you're going to be a law-abiding American, okay, only law-abiding Americans get due process. But then who determines if you don't have due process for everyone, not just law-abiding citizens, if the mere accusation of being a lawbreaker, if the mere accusation of being a terrorist is enough to take away your right to due process, what does it mean? Doesn't mean anything, does it? The NRA says they support due process for law-abiding Americans. Donald Trump says he's going to take away guns from people who are on the no-fly list. The first story I covered when I came here to INFOWARS was about a man who was on his way to see his wife, who was in the military in Japan. As he flew from California to Hawaii, changed planes, got on another plane to go the second leg of the trip. They stopped the plane as it was about to take off, came on and drug him off the plane and said, you're on a no-fly list, you can't fly. Of course, he's in Hawaii. How does he get anywhere without flying? How did I get on this list? He's somebody who was vetted by the TSA. He had an airport worker's license. He'd had a background check for that. It had multiple background checks for firearms. And yet he could not find out who had put him on this super secret watch list, this no-fly list. And all the time that we were reporting on it, they absolutely refused to tell him what he was charged with. They refused to tell him how he could get off of that list. That is the issue, folks. That is the fundamental issue. Most of the Bill of Rights was written as a reaction to the Star Chamber that they had in England, a secret court that could charge you and try you without you knowing what you were charged with, without you being able to answer to those charges, present a defense to those charges, without you being able to have a jury of your peers present to judge whether or not you were guilty of those charges. Now we've got people on the left and the right, the NRA and Obama, all saying we need to take away the firearms from people who are merely accused of being terrorists. There is no due process in that. Here's a statement from the NRA. The NRA believes that terrorists should not be allowed to purchase or possess firearms, period. Well, of course. But have due process before you become a terrorist. You don't become a terrorist by accusation, only by due process. They go on to say, anyone on a terror watch list who tries to buy a gun should be thoroughly investigated by the FBI and the sale delayed while the investigation is ongoing. If an investigation uncovers evidence of terrorist activity or involvement, the government should be allowed to immediately go to court, block the sale, and arrest the terrorist. Hey, you know what? They got the order wrong, okay? First of all, you would investigate, then you would charge and indict and arrest the person. That would stop the danger right there if you arrest them, charge and indict them, and then you would have a trial by jury of their peers. But they say, no, you go to court and then you block the sale and then you arrest the terrorist, okay? The order is wrong. They also say, at the same time, due process protection should be put in place that allow law-abiding Americans who are wrongly put on a watch list to be removed. Well, how do you know you're on the watch list until you start to suffer the penalties from that? Until you're banned from traveling, until you are banned from owning a gun. And we have to understand, folks, that it isn't just going to be airplanes. It isn't going to be but just a few years before the government will have control over all ground transportation as well. They're going to have a transportation grid, an information highway, autonomous cars. They'll be able to stop and block your car from being able to go anywhere if we allow this to continue. You have to understand where this is going. And of course, this is a reaction to a law that was put out earlier by Representative Peter King, a Republican, a neocon extraordinaire. And he tried to put this in back in 2015, which would basically give the Attorney General the right to just take away anybody's freedoms, anybody's basic rights. Now, we've had Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson. We have an article on INFOWARS.com from Daily Caller. They point out, interestingly enough, that he now sees right-wingers as those who pose the same threat as Islamic terrorists. And we've told you this all along. This is really for conservatives, for people who are right-wingers. They continually say they're more concerned about conservative extremists than they are about Islamic extremists. And guess what? This is our own chief of police here in Austin, Art Acevedo. They reported in the story as the city of Austin mayor. No, he's not the mayor. He's the chief of police. They say the minutes show that he shifted the discussion to the threat of right-wing extremists, according to the official minutes. Member Acevedo reminded the council that the threat from right-wing extremists domestically is just as real as the threat from Islamic extremism. And Secretary Jay Johnson agreed and noted that their committee combating violent extremism, by definition, is not solely focused on just one religion. Yeah, it's for all of you folks. And then take a look at what this retailer is doing secretly. We have a story from Kit Daniels on InfoWars.com. Academy, major retailer here in the Southwest and other parts of the country, is creating a database for ammunition purchases and is pulling semi-automatic rifles from the shelves. Academy Sports and Outdoors is gathering personal data on customers who buy more than 10 boxes of so-called assault rifle caliber ammunition. It's also pulling rifles from store shelves in support of the Obama administration agenda. Additionally, Academy is pulling anything that resembles a sporting rifle, including rifle-shaped BB gun, barbecue lighters, and airsoft rifles, like BB guns, okay, from store displays. Although another employee revealed semi-automatic rifles will still be sold upon request. Another one says, well, they're still going to be for sale. And remember, we did this before when there was a mass shooting. We pulled them after Sandy Hook for a week or two. I would expect to see them come back out after a couple weeks. Kit Daniels points out that the FBI's own data reveals that in 2014, less than 250 murders out of 12,000, about 2% were committed with rifles of any type. And that would include the vaguely defined assault rifle. Now, we've seen the editorial from the man who says that it's time to repeal the Second Amendment, writing for the Rolling Stone. He says the Constitution is just simply wrong. We need to make sure that this is repealed. He offers us the outdated argument that when the Second Amendment was put in, we only had muzzle rifles. Let me remind you that we have more people buried in graves in America that were killed with black powder rifles than with anything else. They're very deadly. They were state-of-the-art military weapons. And he says, well, you know, the founders didn't have to weigh the risks of one man killing 49 people. No, they put in the Second Amendment because they knew that one man, a king or a president, could kill millions of people. could kill millions of people to further his agenda. The Second Amendment is a check